I think it was two things. One, it wasn't just that I wanted to go on writing, but that I wanted to write about things that were hard to attach directors to. If you wanted to write about women in any way, you know, 90% of the men directing movies have no interest in women in any real way, except as girlfriends or wives. They don't really want to make movies about them, and they don't. And so the arduous task of getting someone to commit to something that it had anything to do with my life was very frustrating. And then when When Harry Met Sally with Rob Reiner, you know, I wrote that script and I thought, well, I don't really want to direct, but if I did direct, this would be a good movie to start with because there aren't a lot of people in it and there aren't a lot of people in any of the scenes and it wouldn't be that complicated shooting it and all of that. But then Rob did it and he was so brilliant. He did such a brilliant job. He changed the script. He made it so much better than it was. And so I thought, well, I guess if I get to work with the Robs of the world, it won't, you know, why direct? And then my next movie I did with someone else who didn't make the script better. So at about that time, I thought maybe I should think about directing. You know, really, that's what, both the sense that if I became a director, I could at least get my own movies made, my own scripts made, and the sense that I would be interested in subjects that men might not be interested in, and that would, you know, it is still, it's very hard to get people to direct your movies if you're a screenwriter. I had been working on this script with Rob Reiner, and Rob had told me all this stuff about guys, right? And how horrible they are and how unwilling they are to commit in any way, even to the bed of the person they have just had sex with for the rest of the night. And so one day we were sitting around and Rob said, you know, we've told you all this stuff about guys. Now you tell us something about women that we don't know. And it was like, I dare you. I dare you. You will never be able to tell me anything about women I don't know, but try. So I said, well, women fake orgasms. And he said, not with me. So I said, yes, with you. And he said, no, no, no. I said, yes, yes, yes. Well, he went completely crazy. He really did. I mean, he did a total meathead moment and went thundering out to the bullpen at Castle Rock Pictures where all the women were. And I said, get in here. And they all came in and he said, is it true that women fake orgasms? And this group of 6 completely terrified assistants all looked at him and went like this. It was just an amazing moment. So we took that fact and put that into a scene. And it was a very simple scene where Sally tells Harry that, and Harry says, not with me. And she says, yes, with you. And he says, I don't believe it. And she says, you better believe it. It was very simple. And we had a read-through, and Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan read the script. And at the end of the read-through, Meg said, you know, I think this scene would be much funnier if it took place in a restaurant. And Rob said, that's a great idea. Let's do it in a restaurant. And then Meg said, and then I think at the end of the scene, she should have an orgasm. And Rob said, well, that's a really good idea. And Billy Crystal said, and one of the customers can say, I'll have what she's having. And Rob said, and I know just the actor to play that part, my mother. Now, you know, I had started out in the movie business thinking, oh, please don't let them change my lines. Please don't let them do anything to me. And, you know, you hear an idea like that and you think, I am so lucky to be working with these people. I thank God people believe in collaboration. Of course, I get all the credit for that line, which I had, well, I like to think I had something to do with it, because if I hadn't broken the news about faking orgasms, there might be millions of men still walking around the earth not knowing it, and they do know it because of that movie. But it wasn't a really commercial movie. It would have been more commercial had it had a more commercial cast, but I didn't have a very commercial cast. In fact, I had Bette Midler who wanted to do it. And Jeffrey Katzenberg at Disney would not let her out of her contract to do it. I think the movie would have done better if Bette had been in it. I loved Julie Kavner in it, but I begged Jeffrey Katzenberg to let her out of her contract or for him to make it. And he simply had no interest in the subject matter of that movie and told me so. He had no interest in what it was about, which was balancing a career and work. It was about a woman stand-up comic who had 2 children. It's a very funny script and a good script. And Jeffrey isn't really interested in women. His wife is a housewife. He just wasn't there. And it was heartbreaking to me. I went through, it seemed like forever trying to get it made. And then suddenly one day a guy named Joe Roth at Fox said, I'll make this movie with Julie Kavner, and he did it. Well, Sleepless was a script that had been written by 2 or 3 or 4 other writers before me, and it never really worked, but it had this kind of amazing ending on the top of the Empire State Building that just worked no matter what came before it. It's kind of amazing because the characters were sort of gloopy and unfunny and yet you got to the end and you went, oh wow, this is amazing. So, and I needed the money. I had done my first movie, This Is My Life, which I had done for scale, which is not very much money, and I was completely out of dough. And my agent said, oh, here's a rewrite. And it's supposed to happen. It had a director. It had casting attached to it, and not Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. And so I read it, and I thought, oh, I can fix this. I can make this better. So I did a rewrite on it and basically made it into a comedy, or made it into not a comedy, but a movie that had laughs in it, which it didn't at all. And suddenly it was a go picture. And the director who had been attached to it, who had no interest in making a comedy, I guess, bowed out of it. He was gone. And the actors were gone because they weren't really funny. And it was suddenly a script that a lot of people wanted to be in. And I wasn't dying. It wasn't like, oh, I thought, oh, I have to direct this. In fact, I thought, well, this isn't really good enough yet. And they kept saying, don't you want to direct this? And I kept saying, but it's not ready to be directed. I've got to do another rewrite on it. I only worked on it 3 weeks. And no, it's fine. Do anything you want to. I said, well, I've got to bring Delia, my sister, in on it because I need a lot of help if I'm going to direct it. Bring Delia in. That's great. Delia brought a huge number of hilarious things to it. And suddenly, I've never had anything quite like it happen. It was instant. It was like, I think I gave them the script, the first pass in March, and we were scouting in Seattle in early June, and we were shooting in August. It was unbelievable. I have no idea what it was like to direct it because all my experiences as a director are filtered through food, and the food was great in Seattle. That's all I can tell you. And the sun was shining all the time because it was summertime in Seattle. We had to actually, of course, have some rain in the movie, and we had to bring in water trucks, and everyone got really angry at us because there was a drought, and we were wasting water, making rain in the movie. It was, it was this movie where you just thought, I wonder if this is going to work. Who knows? I had no idea. Tom wasn't quite Tom Hanks at that moment. Tom and Meg had done a movie together, and it had been a big flop. Joe versus the volcano. So basically, I thought, well, this is great. We had this fantastic apartment, my husband and I, overlooking the market, a block from the Seattle Pike Place Market, which is one of the, seven wonders of the world as far as I'm concerned. And unbelievable crab and cherries and peaches, and it was great. It was unbelievable experience. And the actors were fantastic. Rosie O'Donnell, who is been a friend of mine ever since, and, who was just starting out, had just been in League of Their Own, and is one of the funniest people that ever lived. And every time we would shoot, she's so shockingly brilliant, and she could take anyone, she would say, you'd say your name, and she would sing a song about you, rhyming everything, using your name, using whatever she knew about you. She was a rapper in some way that was so brilliant, I couldn't believe it. And she's great at everything, she's great at everything she does. It was an amazing experience. David Hyde Pierce, we had such an extraordinary cast looking back on it. So being a writer is easier than having a full-time job. You can make your own hours. So by the time my kids got home from school, I was probably pretty well burnt out as a writer for the day. So it wasn't like, I'm busy, I'm working, get out of here. I think that when I went off to direct This Is My Life, when the kids were 10 and 11 or 11 and 12, I can't remember exactly which, I think they were slightly shocked because they hadn't really had the experience of having a working mother. I was home, I was always available, I did bake cookies, I did do all that stuff at the school, I went on class trips. So even though they knew I worked and they knew that I was a writer, it hadn't cost them in any way. When I went off to do that first movie, I think they were really surprised that their mother actually worked. That was the first true knowledge they had of what that meant. And by the way, I think I was very, looking back on it, I thought, well, they're old enough to handle this. And by the way, they did handle it. But the truth is it was harder for them than I thought it was going to be. But I didn't care. I'm sorry, but I didn't. Well, I didn't care. It was time for me to do this, and I thought, we have a good support system in place. They have a stepfather, they have a father, they have a great nanny, and they'll come visit me every other weekend, and we'll all get through this. But it interested me later when they complained about it, that I hadn't quite been sensitive to it, because it was time for me to do this. I had to do it. And it was only 10 weeks. But, so I was very lucky because I was a writer. But if you're a lawyer, or if you're a doctor, or if you work in a factory, you have hours, you don't have freedom. They don't care that there's a school meeting in a lot of places. So I was very lucky. Had I had a full-time job, I might not have had anything near the ability to be the kind of mother I was for the first 10 or 11 years of their life. I was born in New York, and I was really happy for the first 4 years of my life. And then my parents moved to California, and as far as I was concerned, my life was over, ruined. I had an absolutely clear sense of it, even at the age of 4 or 5. And one of my earliest memories is is that I was now in California. The sun was shining. I was at nursery school, surrounded by happy, laughing children. And all I could think was, what am I doing here? How can I ever get out of this place and get back to where I truly belong? I know I absolutely believed that, and I don't think that's unusual with kids. Not necessarily with the same story I had, but I think a lot of people have a very strong sense early on that they are in the wrong place and that they belong somewhere else. And I knew I belonged in New York. So obviously, when I figured out I wanted to be a writer, which came not that much later, and not a writer, by the way, you've made it sound as if I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a journalist. It didn't really cross my mind that someday I would actually think of myself as a writer. But I wanted to be a journalist, and there was a lot of journalism in New York. That's where you wanted to end up if you were a journalist. So it was a perfect marriage of those two things. They went off every morning in their respective cars to the same office, which was about 4 blocks away from our house. In fact, my mother drove a Studebaker for about 5 years, and when she traded it in, it had something like 9,000 miles on it. I mean, she literally drove to the studio and drove back every day. But we knew that they went there and they wrote movies, and that they wrote together, and they were basically contract writers in the old studio system, and they wrote a movie and it got made. But when I became a screenwriter, I could never, for years, I just wrote scripts that didn't get made. I got paid for them, but I thought, am I ever going to get a movie made? And I looked at my parents who had 14 or 15 credits and thought, this is never, ever going to happen for me. It was a completely different time. But I didn't have a sense of them as much as writers as I did as screenwriters. They were very much in the movie business. Most of their friends were other screenwriters. They were very active in the Screenwriters Guild, and that, and every so often we got to go to the set and meet somebody who was in one of their movies. That was very exciting. Meeting Fred Astaire and people like that. And for a long time I thought it was kind of great that they did this. My mother, of course, was almost the only working woman that anyone knew in Beverly Hills, until at one point one of my friends moved to Beverly Hills, and her mother worked, but her mother had to work because she was divorced. My mother worked out of choice, and she was really the only woman in that community who did, and went through quite a lot in the way of sort of competitiveness from the other women who didn't work, and I think we're extremely irritated that my mother managed to work and have 4 children, none of whom was flunking out of school, quite the contrary, and all of that. But I think she was very defensive about being a working woman in that era. And every so often there would be something at school, and I would say, there's this thing at school, and she'd say, well, you'll just have to tell them that your mother can't come because she has to work. And it was years later that I realized that she could have come. Nobody, she wasn't punching a time clock at 20th Century Fox. When I had children, I had no problem getting to the stuff at school. I just don't think she wanted to go to school and be perceived as that kind of mother. But can't ask her about it now. At night, one of the things you did is that people asked you, your parents said, what did you do today? And you told them. And unlike my experience with my children, where if I asked them what they had done that day and they said nothing, I was that was the end of that. That was not the end of that in our house. In our house, it was very much, you were expected to kind of be entertaining and tell a little story about what had happened to you. They really taught us, I think, how to be writers, because we learned at the dinner table to take whatever mundane thing had happened to us and try to make it a little bit entertaining. Birth order is so significant that you don't have to read a book about it. Really, if you're the first, you absolutely know what it means to be the first. You get all the good stuff. At least it seems to me. Being the first is the best. So I definitely had, first of all, I had the normal things you have as a firstborn child. And then also, when my parents got genuinely crazy later in life, I was the one who'd had the most of the good years with them. So I was very lucky in that way. Back in those days, you like to think that people became alcoholics because X, Y, or Z. They had a broken heart or they were. But now we know that alcoholism is just a disease, and they had it. And it didn't really come into full bloom until they were well into their 40s. My first memory of my mother, which of course came up very easily when I was in therapy, was of her teaching me to read. I mean, that's your first memory of each of your parents is a kind of, sort of key to many things about your life. And mine is, I'm sitting next to my mother and she's teaching me to read and I can read and she is so happy. So imagine what that is to a child. I mean, you're just all you want to do is read because it will make your mother happy. And of course, reading is so great. So I was an avid reader, just constantly reading. And television really didn't come into our lives until I was about 9 or 10, by which time I had already read hundreds and hundreds of books. I was already hooked on the Oz books and the Betsy Tacy books, and you name it, I had read it. Mary Poppins and all of Nancy Drew. I mean, junkie books, great books. I read everything. And Beverly Hills Public Library was a very short bike ride away, and I would go over there and take 3 books out and go back 2 days later and take 3 more books out. I had a couple of great teachers, and probably the teacher who changed my life was my journalism teacher, whose name was Charles Sims. And I always tell this story. I love it. The first day of class, I had already, by the way, decided that I was going to be a journalist, but I didn't know why exactly, except that I'd seen a lot of Superman comics and Lois Lane and all of those, major literary characters like that. And but Mr. Sims got up the first day of class and he went to the blackboard and he wrote who, what, where, why, when, and how, which are the 6 things that have to be in the lead of any newspaper story. And then he did what most journalism teachers do, which is that he dictated a set of facts to us. And then we were all meant to write the lead that was supposed to have who, what, where, why, when, and how in it. And he dictated a set of facts that went something like, the principal of Beverly Hills High School announced today that the faculty of the high school will travel to Sacramento Thursday for a colloquium in new teaching methods. Speaking there will be Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, and 2 other people. So we all sat down at our typewriters and we all kind of inverted that and wrote Margaret Mead and X and Y will address the faculty in Sacramento Thursday at a colloquium on new teaching methods, the principal announced today. Something like that. We were very proud of ourselves. And we gave it to Mr. Sims, and he just riffled through them and tore them into tiny bits and threw them in the trash. And he said, the lead to the story is, there will be no school Thursday. And it was this great epiphany moment for me. It was this, oh my God, it's about the point. It's about figuring out what the point is. And I just fell in love with journalism at that moment. I just fell in love with the idea that underneath, if you sifted through enough facts, you could get to the point. You had to get to the point. You could not miss the point. That would be bad. So he really kind of gave that little ship of mine a major push, because I just fell in love with solving the puzzle, figuring out what it was. What was the story? What was the truth of the story? I think the decision to go to Wellesley was just a very simple one, which was that, first of all, my mother had laid down an edict in the house, which was that we were not allowed to go to any school that had sororities. I don't know why. That's a perfectly good edict, by the way. But I don't know if she laid it down because she hated sororities, which I'm sure she did, or whether it was a very simple way of directing us to a very small number of colleges, all of which were very good, the 7 women's colleges in the East at that time, and Stanford. So I applied to all of them. And I went to Wellesley because I had gone to a slideshow, and it had a really beautiful campus. It was one of those things. Nobody got on a plane and visited colleges in that period. You just, Wellesley was one of the best places you could go to, and most of the very bright women in the United States went to Wellesley or Radcliffe or Stanford. So I chose Wellesley. I went to college in 1958. I was the class of 62. It was an unbelievably bland time in America. It was the end of the 50s. The Happy Homemaker. Betty Friedan was about to publish The Feminine Mystique, and the women's movement was about to begin, as well as quite a few other social movements in the 60s. Everything was about to really break free, but we didn't know that in 1958. It was a very, 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 you were supposed to go to college, you were supposed to get your BA, and then if you were interested in medicine, you were supposed to marry a doctor. So I had this fantastic internship, I thought. I interned for Pierre Salinger, who was the press secretary for John F. Kennedy, for President Kennedy, and I was beside myself getting this internship, 6 weeks in the White House. It never crossed my mind that I would have almost no duties whatsoever, much less even a desk. I had really nothing to do but to sort of hang around and eavesdrop and look through files hoping to find secret documents, which I did find several of, by the way. And, nothing that would seem that exciting, but it had to be there. At the time, I thought, oh my God, look what I've just stumbled onto. But anyway, so I spent most of the summer kind of hanging out, watching the press corps come into the press secretary, going to all the press conferences. A lot of those jobs, you can't, the work they give you to do, if they give you any work to do, which they really didn't. I mean, there was a woman in Salinger's office whose entire job was autographing Pierre Salinger's pictures. I mean, that was not full-time, although she had a desk at least and was paid to be there 5 days a week. But that they didn't have anything worse than that to give out, and I didn't have much to do. But in retrospect, I realized many years later that I was probably the only woman who had ever worked in the White House that Kennedy didn't make a pass out. It kind of sort of made me sad at a certain point, as one person after another revealed herself to have had an affair with the president. And I thought, well, why not me? But then, of course, I realized why not me, which is that I'd had a really bad permanent wave that summer, and I didn't look really great. But it was sad. I did meet the president. He did say hello to me the first day we were introduced. And about 4 weeks later, I would have to say the high point of my entire summer came. I was standing out at the Rose Garden on a Friday afternoon, along with everyone else in the White House, watching the president leave. It may not seem like much to do, but everyone went out to do it. And they were all standing there, and the helicopter had landed to take the president to, I guess, to Hyannisport, or to the plane to Hyannisport, however it worked. So this helicopter is making this terrible noise, and I'm standing there with this whole group of people, and suddenly, and we think he's going to come out of the White House itself, but instead he came right out of his door at the Oval Office door, and right past me, and turned around, and the helicopter's going around, and he goes, "How are you coming along?" And I said, "What?" And that was it. That was my entire relationship with John F. Kennedy, which someday I'm sure the Kennedy Library will ask me about, and I will tell them. Because I don't know how anyone could write a book about that presidency without knowing that. My first journalist job, I was a mail girl at Newsweek. I was hired as you know, we don't have women writers, but if you want to be a mail girl or a clipper, I was promoted to clipper after I was a mail girl, and then I was promoted to researcher, which the men wrote these stories and then the women checked them. That's how it worked in those days. And then I got a job at the New York Post. Yeah. I got a job at the New York Post because there was a newspaper strike in New York, and some friends of mine put out a parody of a couple of the New York newspapers. I wrote a parody of one of the columnists. And the people at the New York Post were very angry about it. They thought that the Post should sue. Not that there was anything to sue. There was no entity to sue, but nonetheless, they were all ranting and raving about how someone should be sued for this. This was before people really understood what parodies were. And the publisher of the Post, Dorothy Schiff, said, "Don't be ridiculous. If they can parody the Post, they can write for it, hire them." And so I got a job as a reporter there. It was a great job. It was fantastic. I covered everything there was to cover. I covered politics and murders and trials and, movie stars and presidents' daughters' weddings, and it was a very small staff. There was a lot of news. You were allowed to write very much with a sense of humor and a certain amount of derision even. We were not the New York Times, and we knew that. And it was a great way to become a writer because you could really find your voice. There were magazines that didn't have a lot of women writing for them, but if you wanted to write for them and you were any good at all, you could. But the New York Times magazine, which, the first assignment I got from them in 1968 or 9 was a fashion assignment. And I had never written about fashion in my life. I knew nothing about fashion. I cared less. But I thought, well, I'll do this, I'll write this, and then they'll see I can write for them, and then I won't have to write about fashion anymore, and I never did. I didn't think of going into film till I was well into my 30s, and had been, I'd been a columnist at Esquire for several years and was fairly well known. And someone came to me with the idea of writing a screenplay, and I thought, well, why not? Everybody was trying to write screenplays at that point. Everyone was trying to get into the movie business. And I thought, well, this will be something that'll be fun and interesting. You know, you don't consciously do these things, and yet you look back. I look back on my life and I realize that about every 10 years or so, I sort of moved laterally, or every 8 years. I was a newspaper reporter, then I became a magazine writer, and then a columnist, which was a kind of different version of it. And then I started writing screenplays. And so it wasn't that I said, oh, it's time for me to do something different. But there's no question that at a certain point, you get to a place where you kind of know what you're doing. And you kind of know that you're going to be repeating yourself if you go on doing it much longer. So when the chance to do something else comes along, you go, well, this might be fun. This might be interesting. And it was interesting because I really didn't know what I was doing, writing screenplays. I wrote quite a few before one got made. I didn't have a screenplay made till Silkwood was made. And I was 40 or so, about 40 or 41. And until I worked with Mike Nichols on that screenplay, it wasn't that Alice Arlen and I hadn't written a good script, but then I went to a whole different kind of, I got to go to school by working with Mike because he was so brilliant at working with you on script and you know, the realization that I had known so little and was learning so much working with him was amazing. Alice was a friend of mine, and she was at Columbia Film School, and she was a good writer. I had read a screenplay that she had done. And I was, by then, divorced and the mother of 2 children, and I had been offered Silkwood. And I couldn't figure out how I was going to go to Oklahoma and do all this stuff and have these 2 children. It was very complicated, and I thought it might be fun to do it with somebody and not have quite the burden. As it turned out, Alice and I actually all, you know, we went to Oklahoma together, and so, but what was great was that we worked together and had a huge amount of fun doing it. She's very brilliant at screenplays and its structure. And so that's how the idea came up, was I just thought, I'll ask Alice to do this with me, and she said yes. One of the things Mike teaches you is that, you know, is constantly asking, what is this story about? What is this scene about? What is this section of the movie about? Just forcing you to understand that if you have a bunch of scenes and they're all about exactly the same thing, at least 2 of them are superfluous. At the same time, if you're in a section of the movie that's about whatever it's about, that section of the movie had better be about that thing, or else it too, you know, etc. So he taught us a lot about that, and then I got to watch him cast. He let us be in the room when the actors came to meet Mike Nichols, the greatest, you know, actors director. And there I learned all this stuff you would never know. And the number of screenwriters who don't know this because directors aren't generous enough to let them in the room, you know, who don't understand that an actor makes your scene work. Actors aren't the enemy, which a lot of screenwriters think. Actors are what make it happen. And, you know, you would watch 3 or 4 actors read a scene and you would think, oh, this is the worst scene I have ever written. This is so embarrassing. I'm going to crawl under the couch. And then the right actor would come in and nail it. And you'd go, oh, my God, I'm a genius. I'm fantastic. Or else the right actor would nail it and you would think, oh, this scene's a little long. I got a little bored right there. Better fix that. So all of those things were things that I learned from Mike. If you came to her with the tragedy, she would, and God knows children have a lot of tragedies, she really wasn't interested in it at all. She wasn't one of those mothers who went, "Oh, honey, tell me what happened to you at school. What did the bad girls do to you?" No, she just would say, "Oh, well, everything is copy." And all she meant was that someday you'll make this into a funny story or a story. And when you do, I will be happy to listen to it, but not until then. And I think she basically taught us a very fundamental rule of humor, probably of Jewish humor, if you want to put a very fine definition on it, although she would not think so, which is that if you slip on a banana peel, people laugh at you. But if you tell people you slipped on a banana peel, it's your joke, and you're the hero of the joke. And it basically is the greatest lesson I think you can ever give anyone. And I always worry I didn't teach it well enough to my own kids because I was such a good mother. I always said, "Oh, honey, tell me what happened to you." I'm kind of mystified that she didn't, because it really is weird and sort of against human nature practically. But that was just who she was. And I always horrified at especially the women I know who go through things like divorces, and 5 years later they're still going, "Oh, look what he did, look what the bad boy did to me," right? Get over it. Turn it into something. Stop being a victim. I mean, that is one of the most important lessons of Everything is Copy, is you must not be the victim of what happens to you. You must own it. You must get above it. And it's, it's just an unbelievable lesson in terms of how to live your life if you are, especially if you're a woman. Especially. It was always one of my most, fundamental irritations with the women's movement in my era of it, was how quickly they embraced victims and victimization, and still do. A huge number of things like these women who get goosed in the office and then file a lawsuit instead of just telling whoever did it to jump off a cliff. "Oh, you can't do that because they'll fire you." So what? So get another job. But they won't, really. They don't fire you. That's the interesting thing, especially in this day and age. So, but I'm very old-fashioned in that way. I just don't get that rush to embrace the victim role instead of just going, just saying something clever, witty, or even lame. It gives you that thing, if you didn't have it anyway, which I may have, but it does reinforce that thing that writers have, which is that third eye, which is always, whatever horrible thing is happening to you, there is always this other thing thinking, better remember this. This might be a story someday. So my second marriage ended in this very melodramatic way. Melodramatic if you weren't involved with it, and dramatic if you were. And I was pregnant, and my husband had fallen in love with this extremely tall woman who was married to the British ambassador, and it was very painful and horrible at the time. But then a few months later, I found myself at a typewriter working on a screenplay, and instead I wrote the first 8 pages of a novel. And it was a novel that I knew, if I could, when I was going through the nightmare of the end of the marriage, I absolutely knew that there was, if I could ever find the voice to write it in, that someday it would be a story. Someday it would be copy. But at the time, I was way too distraught to ever feel that. But, time heals, especially if you've had a mother like mine. So I started writing a novel that became Heartburn, and that was the thinly disguised version of the end of that marriage. People think that when you write something, it's cathartic. And I had written a lot of personal articles at Esquire, and people always say, oh, God, it must have been so great when you finally wrote about having small breasts. No, you get through that, and then you write it. It's not the writing that's the catharsis. The catharsis has happened, and it in some way has moved you from the boo-hoo aspect of things to the, oh, and wait till I tell you this part of the story. Wait till you hear this if you want to hear what, where you really don't want people to feel sorry for you. I have such a strong sense of that I did not ever want people to think, oh, poor Nora. It sold a lot of books. I think there were many men who were made very nervous by it. I think that men were allowed to write about their marriages falling apart, but you weren't quite supposed to if you were a woman. You were just supposed to curl up into a ball and move to Connecticut. But it didn't really matter because as I said, it was, it was a very, I knew what the book was. It's a funny book. And I was very happy that it sold a lot of copies. I think there are a lot of reasons. One is the movie business, which is very much driven by the young male audience that goes to the movies, that drives movie-going. This is why you see a lot of women in television and not in movies. Television is a business that's very much driven by women viewers, so it's wide open for women. And that's part of it, and that's just a little Marxist explanation. But there are many, many, many more women in television now than there were in the movie business. And there are many more women running studios and working at studios. So all of that is evening out. The director thing, I don't think is going to even out, or the screenwriter thing is going to even out until women drive the marketplace as much as men do. And I'm not sure that's ever going to happen, especially since movies in about 20 years, if not sooner, I don't even think people will go to the movies the way they do now. So that will be different. And my advice to everyone is become a journalist. I think everyone should be a journalist. Now, that's totally narcissistic on my part, but I think it's the most amazing way to learn about how people live. I mean, to be able to dip in to other people's lives at the unbelievably ludicrous points you get to when you are a journalist, either when they've just been killed or when they're just about to win the Oscar, or they've just written a really wonderful book, or they've just demonstrated against something worth demonstrating against. I mean, it's truly a way of getting out of whatever narrow world we all grow up in. We all grow up in the most narrow worlds, and then we go to another narrow world, which is college, where no matter how different everyone is, they're all the same. Suddenly, they're all wearing the same things suddenly, and reading the same books suddenly, and thinking about the same philosophical questions suddenly. If you have a chance to be a newspaper reporter for 3 or 4 years before you do whatever you want to do it, because you'll know so much. When we were doing Silkwood, there's a scene in Silkwood that's a union meeting, and at this plutonium factory that Karen Silkwood worked at. Well, I've never worked at a plutonium factory, but I had worked at the New York Post. I did know what people talk about when they work in an office. I know what they talk about the next day. They talk about what they saw on television the night before. That's not a big deal. But if you didn't work In a place like that, you wouldn't know it. Well, anyway, we're shooting this scene in Texas where we were shooting it, and I arrived at the set, and Mike Nichols, who is a brilliant man but doesn't know everything, had put all the people in the scene, the union people and the management people, at a round table because he wanted to shoot at a round table. And I said, no, you can't do that. It's a union negotiation. It's got to be a rectangular table. Now, that's a very simple thing, but we would have looked foolish. And I was the only person on a set of 60 people who had ever been in a union negotiation because I had been on the Newspaper Guild Negotiating Committee at the New York Post. You know, that's the kind of stuff you have to know. You can't just, if you want to go into the movie business, what are you going to write a movie about when you're 22 years old? I'll tell you what, you're going to write about you're going to write your coming of age movie, and then you're going to write your summer camp movie. And then you're going to be out of things because nothing else will have happened to you. So I think it's very good to become a journalist. I had been reading all these books about getting older. I'd looked at all these, you know, when you go through menopause, there are all these books out there called things like The Joy of Menopause. And you think, what is this book about? What relevance does this book have to anything I'm familiar with? None whatsoever. And then 10 years later, as I went into my 60s, there were all these books about how fabulous it was to be older and you know, how you're going to have the greatest sex of your life in your 60s, which I finally realized, you know, I mean, I don't know why people write things like that because they're just lies, you know. But then I thought, well, there might be a circumstance that you could have the greatest sex of your life in your 60s if you had never had sex until then, maybe. But, you know, this stuff was all out there, and I kept thinking, why are people writing this? Why are people saying this? Don't they have necks? Don't they look in the mirror? And one day someone, an editor at Vogue, called me and said they were doing an issue on age, and was there anything I wanted to write about? And I said, yeah, I want to write about my neck. It wasn't anything harder, you know, and I just wrote this funny thing called I Feel Bad About My Neck, which everybody read, a huge number of people. Most people, you know, you don't expect when you have a piece in Vogue to have a huge, you know, people don't buy Vogue necessarily for the articles. But this was an issue all my friends read, and a lot of people said, oh, that was really funny. And I thought, oh, I see. There's a book here. There's a book about getting older. And I started making a list of things that I thought could be written about that no one had written about, like maintenance, which is a full-time career for those of us who are getting on in years, just sort of keeping your finger in the dike so that you don't look like a bag lady. So I made a list of things and then wrote most of the book and sold it. It wasn't, you know, and then there's all sorts of things that aren't about aging, like my summer in the White House when President Kennedy didn't sleep with me. I've always had a very clear sense since I was a kid, you know, reading books about people who didn't live in the United States, about how lucky I was to live here. I don't think there's no place like it. I remember after 9/11, there was a lot of foolish talk about where we would go if we had to leave this place, which I just thought was so idiotic. I couldn't believe it because where could you go? Where could you possibly go? Nowhere. There's no place like this. No place that offers what this country does. It's no big deal that I am a writer. My parents were writers, but it's a big deal that they were writers. It's a big deal that they went to college. You know, that they were that generation of first generation Americans, first generation college graduates, screenwriters, you know, so of course they're kids. I was a child of privilege. My husband, Nick Pileggi, is first generation first generation BA, and he became a writer. He and I are, one generation different, not in our ages, but in our parents' experience. And that wouldn't have happened to him in another place. And it almost didn't happen here, by the way, because he was in junior high school and got his schedule in junior high school, and he was in all vocational classes. And he went to the guidance person and said, "Why am I not in English classes? Why don't I have any classes like my friends have?" And they said, "Oh, you're Italian American. You're not going to need this kind of thing. You're not going to go to college." That was New York City. But he fooled them and, switched out of it. But the point is, you still hear stories like that. I mean, stories from people like Mario Cuomo, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who couldn't get a job after she graduated from law school. There's still a lot of that, stuff. And yet, compared to any place else, this is, by far the best place you could be. Well, I'm a writer, and I'm very lucky because I don't always have to write the same kind of thing. I know how to write in more than one way, which is one of the luckiest things about my life. But I think failure is very hard because you don't really know. You really don't know. People see things that don't work and they think, well, why didn't they know that wasn't going to work? Well, they didn't. They really didn't. They really thought it was going to be fabulous and great, and everybody working on it thought it was. And then it comes out and it doesn't work. It really doesn't work. And you go, too bad that didn't work. But you don't learn. I wish one learned more. It certainly doesn't keep you from failing again, I'll tell you that. The good thing about directing your own writing is that you have no one to blame but yourself. And I'm a big one for that. I would much rather blame myself than have the alibi of saying, well, that wasn't my idea. That's the greatest thing. And also when you write something, you really do hear how you want it said. Sometimes it isn't said that way. It's said much better because you have a really great actor saying it, and they come at it in a completely different way. And sometimes you have a really great actor who missed the joke, and you have a chance to say to them, no, I think the word here you are missing is this, or no, you can at least be there on behalf of the script as the director. But you have a very clear idea when you write something of what you want it to look like. I'm writing something now, though, that I know I'm not going to direct, and there's a great freedom in that. There's a great freedom in not always having to know everything about what's going to happen in the scene, and knowing that if it gets made, it'll be someone else's problem, what the room looks like, what the improv is at the beginning or the end of the scene, all that stuff.